Good morning. I'd love to start with a story. Once upon a time, hospitals got paid. If you went to the hospital with something wrong with you, the hospital would get paid for every single thing it did to you. So if they gave you some medicine, they would get paid for the medicine. If you saw a doctor at the hospital, they would get paid for that. If they did some imaging on you, they would get paid for that. And every person who came to the hospital got paid for the things that they did to you while you were in the hospital. What kind of incentive system do you think this sets up for hospitals? And can I switch to a handheld mic? Because I think the heat on this one is just going to drive me bonkers. Does it incentivize the hospital to keep you away from the hospital? Does it incentivize the hospital to do less stuff when you're at the hospital, to do conservative care? No, it does not. In fact, it sets up an incentive system where the more people that come to the hospital, the better, and the more stuff they do to you when you're in the hospital, the better. All right, if you're the federal government and you're paying for the health care of, say, the 60 million people who are on Medicare, you do not love this incentive system, which we used to call fee for service. Instead, you might have some ideas about how to set up a different financial incentive structure for hospitals that incentivizes them to keep people out of the hospital and incentivizes them to do less stuff when people come to the hospital. Maryland had such an idea for how to pay hospitals in its state starting in 2014. In 2014, Maryland said to the hospitals, okay, we're going to put you on a global budget. We're going to give you X millions of dollars to take care of everyone who walks through your doors this year. It doesn't matter how many people come to the hospital. It doesn't matter what you do to them when they're there. All we're going to adjust this payment for is the sickness in general of the kinds of people that you generally take care of at your hospital. Does this set up an incentive system for the hospital to keep people out of the hospital? Absolutely it does, because every person who doesn't come to the hospital, they still get paid for it. Does this set up an incentive for the hospitals to do less when people come to the hospital? Absolutely. Because the less stuff they do at the hospital when you're there and get you out the door faster with fewer tests, fewer drugs, fewer imaging, the more money they make. Don't worry, we're also going to subject them to some quality constraints. So they're not just going to send you home with your broken arm having done nothing to you. And don't worry, we're also going to set up some monitoring programs to make sure that they don't just send all of the patients who come to their door to the hospital next door and say, ha, 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 we're going to keep the money. Okay, so this hospital global budget program was an idea that Maryland had to save money. And naturally, a question might arise if you are Maryland, did this work? Did we save money? Did we continue to provide high quality hospital care for the residents of our state? And one way to ask, did it work, might be to look at the budget that you gave to each hospital and then look at how much they spent that year and see whether the amount that the hospital spent was above or below the budget. And if they spent under their budget, you say, huzzah. And if they spent over their budget, you say, ooh. But this isn't exactly a question about how well this program worked. This might be as much a question about how good are we at setting budgets. It might be that we're just terrible at budgeting, and the reason all the hospitals overspent was because we set their budgets too low, or vice versa. Really, the question, did it work, is a causal question about what would have happened. So let me introduce a little bit of notation just to prove to you that I'm a real statistician. The did it work question is a question of potential outcomes. Has anyone ever heard of this potential outcomes notation before? Oh, wow, like 2 hands. This is awesome. The expectation, which is E, of the outcome, which is Y, under the condition that you did get the treatment that I'm offering, and in this case, the treatment means this new global budget program, is denoted expectation of Y of 1. The expectation of the outcome under the condition that I did do hospital global budgets. And I'm going to contrast that to the expectation of the outcome under the condition that I did not give you global budgets. And my target estimate, and the thing that I really care about, is the difference between what happened with global budgets and what would have happened without global budgets. One of these things I get to observe because I did enact global budgets, and so I just look at how much money we spent in Maryland with global budgets. One of these things involves me getting in my TARDIS and traveling to an alternative universe where we didn't do global budgets. And my NIH grant budgets are too small to support TARDIS in the grant budget. So we have to find an alternative to going to a parallel universe. We can't get in our TARDIS. So we might look at other states nearby and say, what happened in Virginia? What we really want is the difference between what happened in Maryland with and without, but we might look to a neighboring state to help us figure out what might have happened. And we might have data over time that would help us investigate this question. Where should I point this thing? It feels very slow. Okay, one idea that we might have about what would have happened in Maryland without the global budgets is that spending on hospitals would have risen over time. Or we might think that maybe hospital spending would have gone down over time had we not done this whole global budget thing. If I tell you that in neighboring Virginia, hospital spending went down, do you now have a new idea of what a more likely trajectory for Maryland would have been in the absence of implementation of global budgets? Do you think it would have gone up or gone down? Is one of those more likely? Maybe the down is more likely because that's what happened next door in Virginia. This fundamental insight that we can use the trajectory of a comparison group who didn't undergo the treatment and compare that to what did happen in Maryland, this is the whole big idea behind a thing that I have spent the last 7 years of my life doing methodological research on, which is called difference in differences. It turns a simple double subtraction of the difference that occurred in Maryland versus the difference that occurred in neighboring Virginia. That double subtraction, it layers some causal assumptions on top of it, and it says we can causally attribute the differential change between these two states to the hospital global budget program. This is such a simple idea that it is extremely popular. Maryland's change with the budgets, Virginia's change without the budgets. We do this double subtraction. I'm just doing algebra here. There's nothing fancy. We're just rearranging terms. Now we're able to do this double subtraction, and that difference in differences is our target causal estimate now. The key insight is that Virginia here stands in for what would have happened in Maryland, and if we believe that, then we do causal inference. This is incredible. I work in health policy. Difference in differences is incredibly popular. This is the proportion of PubMed articles that use difference in differences over time. 2011 is when I joined my department at Harvard. 2023 is where we are today, I guess. Wow, that's crazy. I published a bunch of these. Some of these are mine. And this is in the applied world. Why? Well, now finally we get to the point of why we are here at a data science conference listening to me talk about how hospitals get paid. Because the healthcare system is filled with people who have cool ideas about how to do things better, how to pay for care better, how to deliver care better, how to make it higher quality, how to improve outcomes. Those people, they're experimenting all the time, but they're not experimenting like scientists necessarily. They're not setting up a randomized controlled trial and randomly giving people one thing and randomly giving another people another thing. Instead, what they do is they just go out willy-nilly and they do their ideas. And then we poor researchers have to come in later and say, did it work? Oh my gosh, we gotta study it. Helpfully, the healthcare system throws off enormous amounts of data. Just in the regular course of doing business as a healthcare system, it generates this wild flow of data. On one hand, every time you go to the doctor or the hospital and get something done, that healthcare provider fills out a very long form, or more precisely, their administrative staff fill out a very long form, which they then send to someone who's going to pay the bill. It might be the insurance company, it might be the state where you live if you're covered by Medicaid, it might be the federal government if you're covered by Medicare. But in any case, this form documents all the things they did to you and why they did it, what diagnoses you had. Those are billing claims. At the same time, they're also on their computer, typing away during the whole visit, entering things about you in their electronic medical record system. That electronic health record is the way doctors talk to each other most of the time in the healthcare system, and that electronic medical record system is also an enormous treasure trove of data. Now, we researchers, we didn't design any of this. If we had, we might have designed these systems differently. But the helpful thing is that this data collection system is just happening all the time, whether we ask it to or not. And so we almost always have observations of people in a state like Maryland, before global budgets and after global budgets. And we also have data on people in a neighboring state like Virginia before global budgets and after global budgets, which didn't happen in Virginia. It's just there waiting to be mined like a treasure trove of information about what would have happened if we believe these causal assumptions. This is the reason that difference in differences is so popular in the world I work in, which is health policy, where people are going around willy-nilly implementing their ideas without designing a study. But we have this digital exhaust kind of being thrown off the healthcare system all the time, so we can implement this method. I came here today to tell you a bunch of stories about ideas for improving difference in differences. Like I said, I've been doing this work for a long time, so I've been coming up with cool ideas to try and make it better, and I came prepared to talk about 5 ideas. However, we are 5 minutes from the end of my time. So I'm going to tell you about like 1 or 2 of these. I'm getting signals that maybe we have a little more time. I don't want to keep you from lunch. That won't make me a popular plenary speaker. So I'm going to tell you about just a couple of these ideas that I've been working on to try to show you the hidden complexity in this seemingly very simple idea of doing double subtraction and poof, getting causal inference, and how that could possibly go wrong. So one of the things I'm going to tell you about is this impulse that many people have to make their 2 groups, their treated group and their comparison group, remember Maryland and Virginia, look more similar. Imagine on the left-hand side here that we have 2 populations of units. Suppose these are hospitals in Maryland and hospitals in Virginia. And at baseline, they come from 2 different populations. The orange dots and the red dots are 2 separate populations of hospitals. They have different means on something we care about, like, say, spending. And difference in difference only requires that their trajectories be the same over time in the absence of treatment. So in this case, everything is fine. The red dots and the orange dots are just totally flat over time. Nothing is different about them. They're evolving in parallel. Everything is totally copacetic. No worries. On the right-hand side, though, we again have orange and red dots, but this time they're all from the same population. It just happens that the way we assigned treatment, for instance, is we took all the dots that had the highest value of the outcome and we assigned them to treatment. And we took all the dots that had the lowest value of the outcome and we assigned them to control. And now we have sort of created this difference in the means of the 2 groups by differentially assigning treatment on the basis of their baseline outcome. Unfortunately, in this situation, what's going to happen is that even in the absence of any kind of intervention, those 2 sets of dots will sort of regress back to their common mean over time. Have you ever heard of regression to the mean? Right, this is a very basic statistical phenomenon. So on the right-hand side, this would really mess up our diff and diff, because even in the absence of any kind of cool intervention, like global budgets, the 2 sets of units are just going to regress back to their common mean, and that will create artificially this differential change in the units that we might, unfortunately, attribute to the treatment if we didn't know any better. Well, one idea that people have in the literature about how to prevent this phenomenon from happening is matching. Let's make the 2 sets of units more similar at baseline. Maybe that will fix our problem. Matching, which, just trust me, is super popular. I've pulled like 4 random quotes from different papers in literature. People love matching. It makes us feel really good when our units look similar at baseline. We really like that feeling when they're like very comparable to one another, right? What could possibly go wrong? Well, matching is trimming. Matching is throwing away some units that are not good matches for one another. So imagine that in the left-hand side scenario, we start trimming off units. We trim the really low ones and we trim the really high ones, and we make our units in both groups more similar to one another. So now we've sort of gotten rid of that baseline difference. And in the right-hand side scenario, we do the same thing. We trim away the units on the top and the bottom, and we get rid of some of that baseline difference. What is going to happen, even if there is no intervention, even if nothing is going on at all in the world? Any guesses about where these red and orange dots are going to regress to in the left-hand side scenario? Are they going to stay together or will they grow apart? Who thinks they'll stay together? Who thinks they'll grow apart? We've got some very timid voters out there. Well, since they came from different populations, they're going to go back to their respective means. When we release the constraint and we just watch them evolve over time, they're going to regress apart from one another. Okay, what about in the right-hand side scenario? We matched them, we made them similar. Are they going to stay together? Raise your hand if you think they're going to stay together. Who thinks they're going to regress apart? Still with the timid voting, okay. They're going to stay together because they came from the same population. So when they regress back to their mean, it's a common mean which we sort of match them to be more similar to. So when I first introduced these two groups, when there was no matching going on, the left-hand side scenario was biased. Ooh. Sorry, with matching, the left-hand side scenario is biased. The right-hand side scenario is unbiased only if we match. So now we're in this really difficult situation where matching, in one case, fixes a biased study. And in the other case, introduces bias into what had been a totally fine study to begin with. This is so awkward. I don't know whether to tell you to match or not to match in your difference in differences study. Because what we have to understand is, why did the difference between the two groups that you're studying arise? Were they similar from the same population and you picked off the highs and the lows and gave treatment to the highs and not treatment to the lows? Or were they just different populations who happened to, the high population got treatment and the low population didn't get treatment? This paradox was the subject of a paper that I wrote with my former student, Jamie Daw, who's now faculty at Columbia, who says, watch out, matching can create bias. We were responding to a paper in the literature that had said, you guys, match, it's really important. You gotta get rid of that bias. We said, wait. It might not be that simple. This is an example of one of these situations where a really benign seeming idea, let's just make the groups more similar. That seems fine, right? Can have profound consequences if you don't think carefully through the causal mechanisms that are behind your data generating process. All right, that was one example of a thing where sometimes your good ideas can go terribly wrong. I'm gonna skip over some of this confounding stuff. Trust my former student, Brett Zeldo, when he warns you that you should align your regression strategy with the confounding model that you have in mind. Instead, I'm going to skip to another pretty sensible idea that people have. Difference in differences, as I said, assumes that in the absence of any kind of intervention, the two groups would have evolved in parallel. And before, I was just showing you pre and post, before and after. There's only 2 time points. But usually, we have a lot more information than that. Usually, we've been watching these two groups over time for some long pre-period. I told you Maryland did global budgets in 2014. Well, we've been watching them since 20 whatever. We have a lot of years of data. So we've been watching them evolve in parallel. And so it's very tempting to say, what has happened in the evolution of these two groups over the time period when we've been watching them, when neither of them were treated? Have they been evolving in parallel? And if they have in the past been evolving in parallel, then maybe we have a lot more confidence in the assumption that they would have continued to evolve in parallel in the absence of the intervention. And so generally how this goes is we sort of plot the data in the pre-period, we squint our eyes, we say, yeah, that looks parallel, right? And maybe if the reviewers of our paper really push us, but how do you know they're parallel, they might say. We'll say, don't worry, we did a hypothesis test. We tested, and we found no evidence that they were not parallel. This is what people do in the literature all the time. Reviewers are constantly asking for this. I have beef with this. I think there are 2 problems with testing for parallel trends. There is both a statistical problem, I'm a statistician, and there is a conceptual problem. The conceptual problem is that it is neither necessary nor sufficient for the trends in the pre-period to be parallel in order for your study to satisfy this true causal assumption, which is that in the absence of intervention, the difference from pre to post would have been parallel. That is fundamentally untestable because it involves that parallel universe that we can't visit. It involves what would have happened. So it doesn't actually test the assumption, which is what everyone says they're doing in their papers, unfortunately. And the statistical problem is that it tests the wrong hypothesis. Ooh. And it's really underpowered. So it leads you to make mistakes of a sort that are really damaging for your causal inference. Let me tell you about both of these. The idea that we have in mind when we test for parallel pre-trends is that whatever was happening in the pre-period would have continued. these lines would have kept along going, doing exactly what they were going to do. If they were non-parallel, they would have stayed non-parallel, and if they were parallel, they would have stayed parallel. However, the real world is much more complicated than that. In fact, what might have happened is that they look really non-parallel, but oh gosh, they were going to zag right back together. They zig, they zag, it's fine. This would have been a fine diff and diff because the average change from pre to post is the same in the two groups. If we just zoom out from that same picture a little bit, this is what real data looks like. Are these parallel? I mean, I guess, right? Like they didn't, on average, change very much, but they're zigging and zagging all over the place. That's the conceptual problem. The statistical problem is that what happens is we test the null hypothesis, there is no difference. The trends are exactly parallel. The difference between them is 0. And we pass that test if p is greater than 0.05. This is so weird because in general, what we're always looking for is p less than 0.05. That's how you get your paper published, right? Here, we celebrate when p is greater than 0.05 because we failed to find any evidence that our study is broken. And if we do find evidence that our study is broken, that our trends are non-parallel, then we don't just give up and say, oh, I guess I can't publish now, I'm gonna go home. No, instead we go looking for a better comparison group, we fix up our model, we do some matching maybe, I don't know, that seems like a good idea. We keep going. The problem is that this tightly controls the wrong kind of error. In general, what this will lead to is that if we have a lot of data, I'm still trying to figure out where to point this thing. I think it's at that laptop over there is why I need to stand over here. If we have lots of data, eventually we will always be able to reject this null hypothesis, right? As n goes to infinity, p goes to 0. So we will eventually be finding trivial differences that we don't care about in these parallel trends. And if we have insufficient data, say because we've cut our sample basically in half by only studying the pre-period, we will often fail to find meaningful differences. Don't worry, statistics to the rescue. We know how to solve this problem. Let's just test a different hypothesis test. We can reformulate that. Now suppose that the parameter theta represents the differential trend in these two groups. How different are the trends? We really would like for that thing to be 0, but what we're gonna look for is evidence against the hypothesis that theta is big, that there is a meaningfully large difference between the trends in the two groups. So now we test this null hypothesis, and bada boom, bada bing, we have fixed this up. So now we are tightly controlling the probability that we make the following kind of error, which is we say they're parallel when they're not, which is the kind of error that's gonna screw up our causal inference when we do diff and diff. This is excellent. Thank you, clinical trial statisticians, for introducing us to this idea of equivalence or non-inferiority testing, which is what you do when you want to prove that your drug is not worse than its competition, or maybe is as good as or equal to something that is not better, all right? So now we rule out these meaningful differences. We've solved this problem that with enough data, we will always eventually reject the null. Now with enough data, we will always be able to rule out meaningfully large differences. This is excellent. My former student, Alyssa Belinsky, who's now faculty at Brown, says don't use conventional hypothesis tests, even if the reviewers really want you to. Okay. In the very last minutes of this, I'm going to tell you about something that I think is cooler to people who like to think about AI and machine learning and stuff, but first I have to click through a lot of slides to get there. Just a few more, my friends, hold on. All right. I told you one thing we don't want to do with the pre-period data, which is do this dumb null hypothesis test. Can we think of a cooler use of the fact that we've been observing these groups over time for a long time? We have a lot of history with them. We know something about how they've been evolving. One idea that we have is to use our learning about how the groups are evolving to change our identification assumption entirely and do a totally new kind of causal inference that opens us up to really awesome prediction modeling, which is the kind of thing that I think a lot of people in this room get more excited about than dumb linear regression models. Imagine that we've been watching these two groups over time, and what we've learned is that they follow straight lines. It's awesome. They just evolve in a straight line. We fit a model. It doesn't have to be a hard model. It can be a straight line to those two groups over time, and we use that model to predict what would have happened in the post period in the absence of intervention. Suppose now that we then observe what did happen in the comparison group during that post period. And now we see what we missed. Our model missed the fact that that comparison group was about to take a sharp downward turn. Whoops, our prediction model was not great, but it's okay because now we've learned what our model misses. We've learned something about the prediction error that we're making in general about this system. That observed comparison group prediction error can then be transported over to our treatment group, and now we can adjust our prediction for the treated group in light of what we've just learned about our prediction model and say, now we have a corrected prediction for the counterfactual, untreated potential outcome of the treated group, which is the whole thing we need to do causal inference. This is awesome. What's even more awesome about this is that it turns out with the correct choice of prediction model, I can reproduce all of these conventional, familiar, feels good like a warm blanket causal inference methods that people have been doing for decades, including difference in differences. If my prediction model is simply specified as, skipping over this, the baseline mean, which is what all this means in notation. If my prediction model is just whatever happened in the pre-period, that's what would have happened in the post-period. With that dumb prediction model, I can recover difference in differences from this causal inference assumption, which is that the prediction errors are equal in the two groups. And with equal expected prediction errors, which is the very dumb name that we're giving to this very cool idea, we can now open ourselves up to a whole world of very cool and sophisticated prediction modeling. Because the pre-period is our prediction sandbox now. In that pre-period, which is uncontaminated by anything about treatment, it's uncontaminated by the real causal inference that we're doing, we can train prediction models. And in particular, we can train prediction models to do as good a job in the treated group that will eventually get treatment as it does in the comparison group, which is our fundamental causal inference assumption, that our prediction errors are the same in treated and control. So now we can fit a bunch of prediction models, see how they do in the pre-period, and choose the one that does the best at equalizing the prediction errors between the two groups. And these prediction models could be anything. They don't have to be straight lines. They don't have to be flat lines, which is what all of diff and diff and comparative interrupted time series and all these other methods are doing. They could be neural nets or causal forests or BART or whatever cool thing you want to do. So we think this is a really interesting and promising technique for extending a very familiar kind of causal assumption to much more sophisticated and interesting big data, machine learning, whatever you want sorts of techniques. So this is my current postdoc, Tom Levitt, who says, you can use a model to predict and then debias those predictions. And with that, I am going to summarize these 5 research areas, only 2 of which I talked about, and say thank you so much for your time and attention. I know we must have time for questions, and I would love to take some in our remaining 4 minutes. Say, yeah, up here.
So, I think difference is it's commonly used if you don't have opportunity to do randomized control experiments. And I wonder, have you considered other options, in terms of the cases when you cannot do randomized control experiments, for example, discontinuity regression, and all sort of techniques, and then compare. In the case of the Maryland global budget thing,
Yeah, so there are other of what are called quasi-experimental causal inference methods. Regression discontinuity is one of them. Comparative interrupted time series is one of them. Instrumental variables is another one. The difference between diff and diff and those related techniques, especially regression discontinuity and IV, or instrumental variables, is that diff and diff is basically a totally general purpose tool. Anytime you have a group that gets treatment and a group that doesn't, and you watch them before and after, you can use it. Supposedly, all these causal assumptions. So it's very general purpose. With regression discontinuity, you have to find a case where the treatment is assigned on the basis of some kind of sharp cutoff, such that just above and below that cutoff, the groups are exchangeable. And instrumental variables, you have to have an instrument which is related to treatment but not outcomes, that is like the randomization instrument of RCTs. And so those are very special purpose. You have to find just the right situation to use them, which is why I've spent my time on difference in differences, because it is apparently so general purpose, everyone is using it all the time in a million different circumstances, and that makes it a very rich environment to do this methodological work. But those are competitor techniques.
Thank you so much. Hi, Professor Hatfield. Thank you for your talk and just crunching all the information into digestible pieces in such a short period of time. I wanted to talk about the example that you gave, the differences between Maryland and Virginia, just as a case study. And as you were presenting, I was just thinking, yes, we might be able to see some similarities in the results, but just as the panelists before you spoke about, there might be nuances in the different cities. Like there might be other things that impact the health system. There might be other things that impact the people that live there. And so how do you reconcile that with the outcomes that you find when you run statistical models? It seems like quantitatively it's rigorous and it makes sense. I'm just wondering how in real life contexts it would be applied. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. Maryland and Virginia, I lived in Baltimore, Maryland for 2 years. So these are places that are close to my home. I also wrote 2 papers about Maryland global budget programs. So it's actually something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And you're absolutely right. Maryland and Virginia are not like each other in really important ways. Baltimore, for instance, is a very special city. It has a lot of really unique features to it. And we don't really think that there is a place like Baltimore in Virginia. And a lot of the hospital care that happens in Maryland happens in Baltimore. So the fact that they are not similar to one another is a problem, except that the causal assumption of difference and differences is only that they would have stayed as dissimilar as they are, right? They can be as dissimilar as you want, as long as they would have stayed the same amount dissimilar. Then their evolution would have stayed on the same track. And that's what's appealing about diff and diff as opposed to some other causal inference techniques like matching or propensity score adjustment or regression adjustment, where the key assumption is that there are no unobserved confounders. You may have heard this assumption before. It means that conditional on everything we've observed, Maryland and Virginia's outcomes are essentially exchangeable. We can just compare them straight up. We don't need an assumption that strong. We only need that Maryland and Virginia would have stayed as dissimilar as they were over time. Thank you so much.